So sorry I'm late today. Back on track. So we're talking about the IS curve. It's chapter 10 in the first edition, if you've got that to follow along. I understand it. Somebody told me that they had a first edition and it cost like $10. Is that, yeah, it was not a lot of money. You know. That just warms my heart as an economist because the thing, as you may know, the thing about textbooks, first of all, it's a total scam. And second of all, the way in which it's a scam is that textbook companies, and I mean the authors are complicit in this because they get paid to do it, they put out new editions of their textbooks in order to fleece you. And so then you have to pay $150 for the new edition or something like that. And with all the fancy bells and whistles. And I don't think that as Queens College students that's what you need to be doing. I think you are better off just looking at the lecture slides and the old version of the textbook, which is just as good as the new one. Just a little bit less shiny and maybe a little bit more rumpled around the edges, kind of like me, perhaps. So anyway, I get a kick out of that. Okay, so problem set number 8 is due this upcoming Sunday at midnight. Let me just reiterate that most students do the problem sets on time, but there have been 1 or 2 students I've noticed who do them after the due date. That's fine, but you don't technically get credit for having done it if it's late. Okay, so please do them on time, but they are there for you to, for practice basically. You could retake these multiple choice problem set exams over and over and over as review if that is helpful to you. But again, please, they are due when they are due, and if you complete them afterward, you're not going to get credit for it. Another reiteration here, there's going to be no class on a couple of Tuesdays, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving and also the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, and I'll continue to remind you of that. The college is open, but we will not have class because I'm traveling to go and present some research. And I need to devise a way to make up the time for you, and I think what it may be is an extended week of office hours or something like that in December. I'm just going to close the door. Hang on. So I'll let you know about that in December. I think that's the way to make it up to you. It depends a little bit because I've got maybe I've got a traveling schedule, so things might be a little interesting. But I apologize for the inconvenience. I also you're welcome if this is good news that you don't have to come to class on Tuesday before Thanksgiving and also the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. On Monday, November 18th, from noon to 1 p.m., so this is a Monday and you may not be available on that day, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the president of that Fed Bank, will be speaking at Queens College in Campbell Dome. And that's the big round thing that's sort of in back of, well, or rather within, if you like, Powdermaker. It's right next to Powdermaker Hall where the econ department is. And if you are interested in attending, and I think it will be a very fascinating conversation with him. He will be taking questions from the audience. You have to register in advance. There are a limited number of seats. You should email me or talk to me after class if you'd like to attend that, and we can set that up. Any questions about the course logistics at all? We're coming down the home stretch now. This is now November, and we've got this month, but then interrupted by Thanksgiving and of course the class before that as well. And then we don't have a lot of time in December, so I guess the good news is that the econ201 is drawing to a close for you, and the bad news is that it's drawing to a close for you, and you might have to study. But as I said, I think I will hold extended office hours in December prior to the final exam. Okay, so moving on to the course material. What are we talking about now? It's called the IS curve. And the I stands for investment. That's I guess the intuitive thing that is good for you to remember. The S, it turns out, actually historically stood for saving. Here, that's not quite as obvious why it does even show up in the name, but it's called the IS curve, and it's this downward sloping relationship where what we posit is that macroeconomic activity responds to the interest rate. So the higher the interest rate, the lower the short-run output ought to be. Short-run output is the measure of the percentage deviation in current output from the potential. So if it's positive, that means that you're operating above potential. If it's negative, you're operating below potential. And this downward sloping relationship just says the following, that if the interest rate were to rise from some level R1 up to R2, then the story is that demanders in the economy who are sensitive to interest rates, and these are a lot of people, new home buyers, also people who maybe have adjustable rate mortgages also might react to this too. So if you have an adjustable rate mortgage, the interest rate goes up, you pay more per month, and that means you have less money to spend on other things. New home buyers who traditionally have sought fixed rate mortgages would also see higher borrowing costs and might buy either less house or not buy house at all. That could also happen. And you can think about car buyers, anybody who has to borrow to buy durable investment goods. It could also be students facing student loans. Typically, many of those are subsidized, but there are some students who have to take out private loans, especially if you go to like Harvard Law School or something like that. All these individuals who are dependent on credit then reduce their purchases when the interest rate is higher, and that's what this story is all about. And short run output, which is Y tilde, it's got this little funny twiddly thing over the top of it, falls from Y tilde 1 to Y tilde 2. All right, so that's the basic story, but today we are going to talk about why this looks the way it does and what in particular we are supposing about the way the macroeconomy responds. So we could just specify this, kind of like how a demand curve just always slopes down, but recall that there is a reason why demand slopes down. In the case of labor demand, or for the demand for capital, as we saw in the first part of the course, the story is that there is diminishing marginal productivity of either one of those two inputs on their own. The story about a demand curve, say for donuts, is that as you eat more donuts, the marginal utility of an additional donut goes down, right? So you've had the first donut, that's pretty good. That's a high marginal utility that, you'd be willing to pay a very high price for that. But then with each additional donut that you buy, you start getting filled up with donuts and the marginal utility is lower. Just like that then, there's a reason why the IS curve slopes down. And let's talk about this more in detail. We covered this a bit last time, but to review, the notation is the following. The current output we observe is what's actually happening in the macroeconomy, uppercase Y. Long run or potential output is what comes out of the growth model. It's technology, uppercase A, times capital to the 1/3 times L to the 2/3. It's what the economy could be doing if all the demanders were participating fully, if they were playing their roles as they maybe ought to be. And there is going to be a difference between the two of these things often. And we're going to focus on the percentage difference, Y minus Y bar over Y bar, the percentage that GDP is above or below its potential. If Y tilde is positive, you're above potential. If it's negative, or below. And in particular, the IS curve is going to derive from this kind of thinking. We're going to look at each different component of GDP and think about how it varies or does not vary. And in particular, we're going to simplify and imagine that consumption is not going to vary with much. Investment is really going to be the big story, and then later in the class, we're going to think about exports and imports also being things that will vary with real interest rates. So we're going to think about how each of these things behaves over the business cycle. And here's what we've got. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. Again, this is something that you need to know for the class. If this is unfamiliar, please try to commit this to memory. It's the most basic relationship in econ201, the national income identity, that GDP is equal to the sum of these expenditure side things, consumption, investment, government, and net exports. So technically this is actual GDP, which includes the fluctuations, and we're going to just assume that the fluctuations come from the demand side, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case in reality, and there are many people who argue that it isn't, but that's our basic story in econ201. Imports and exports can be written out separately, and then what we're going to do is think about how each of these things behaves over time. Yeah, sometimes I kind of wish that the text and the slides didn't actually split up the net exports and the two different components, because it turns out that it doesn't really make a lot of sense to think about them separately, but we're going to do that to some extent anyway. On this next slide, I'm going to show you the time series of each of these things, and I've got net exports together just to kind of clear up the clutter. I showed you this last time. Of these four series, which one is the most wiggly? It's investment. Yeah, investment is definitely the most wiggly. And so that's going to be the one that has some interesting story behind it. That for now we're going to assume that net exports are basically stable. They actually do wiggle a little bit if you look, especially during this period. And if you look closely too, what do you see here? In fact, net exports are kind of wiggling in an opposite direction compared to investment. And that's going to come up again later, that in fact there's a reason to believe why that might be happening. Government also does wiggle a little. If it's a sort of an optical illusion, because the green line for investment is wiggling so much, it makes it look like the government line is wiggling more. It does wiggle a little bit, but not a ton, I wouldn't say. And actually, if you can squint, what has been happening to government as a share of GDP in the last, say, year or two? Decreasing. Yeah. That's actually probably that's the truth, and it's probably the unknown, unembraced truth, I would say, that most people would imagine that what has been happening, that Obama guy, he's just been, increasing government spending willy-nilly, right? Well, turns out actually not. Some of this is states and localities reducing government spending, because that also shows up in capital G. It's spending by the federal government, but also by states and localities. And the states have been cutting back quite a bit after the recession. Consumption actually has this interesting upward drift here, and we're not really going to talk about this in the course. When I plotted this out for you, and this is actually a new graph for you in fall 2013, I looked at it and I said, oh boy, we've got consumption that's drifting upward, which is not really part of the story I'm going to tell you, but it is in the data. And so then I debated, well, should I monkey with it or even show it to you at all? And I decided, well, let's just leave it in there and try to explain what's happening here and what's the key takeaway. The key takeaway is that consumption, although it is trending upward slightly, is basically a straight line with a few little hiccups along the way. But it's a lot more stable than investment. Still, it is the case that we've seen over the past, this is 43 years-ish, we've seen consumption rise as a share of GDP. And this is in the data. It's a somewhat of a different story than what we see elsewhere around the world. I think in China, if anything, consumption probably has fallen as a share of GDP because the rest of GDP probably has increased rather rapidly. I would have to look at that. But overall, I know that the government, but especially the investment share of Chinese GDP is just enormous. And I don't think that Chinese consumption is rising as a share of GDP. We are an advanced economy, and we're also aging. The population is getting older on average, and I think that's part of what this is telling us, that the consumption share is actually sliding upward a little bit because the average person in the economy is now more older and thus consumes a little bit more than he or she used to. So this is the story with the data, and what we're going to do is squint and say, well, net exports are, an average of about, I think it's, minus 2% of GDP or something like that. Consumption is on average, I think, 0.64%. These things are roughly their long-run averages, and then there are going to be little wiggles around them in particular instances. So that's what this next slide says, that over time, these expenditure shares have been roughly stable with a little bit of drift, especially in consumption, but investment is the big outlier there. And so as a result of that, we're going to model each of these components as basically constant shares, and it's going to be of potential GDP, which is a little different than what I just showed you, but it's the same basic idea. The confusing thing is that we're going to introduce this algebraic notation, so a little c is equal to 0.64, and that's just a fancy and probably confusing way of saying that the consumption share of GDP is on average 64%. Government has been about 20% over the decades. That's actually rather large, right? I mean, it's a sizable chunk of the economy. Technically speaking, Obamacare and Medicare don't really account for that because government is, in the case of Medicare, is spending transfer payments that then purchase medical care, but all that's actually private. This 20% is comprising things like highways, like defense, but also like education. So we are actually government spending, or rather I am. You're not. you're part of what you're doing probably is considered consumption spending, which would be the tuition that you're paying, and then in addition there are a bunch of state subsidies, and that's me basically. Exports are about 9%, imports are 11%, and so the difference then would be 2%. Investment has averaged 18%, but it has jumped around a lot too. So the little AI is going to be equal to 0.18. That's 18% of GDP, but then there's going to be a fluctuation term that helps us understand why, in fact, it would be fluctuating. Note finally then that these expenditure shares all sum up to 100%, or the number 1, and that's going to come up shortly. So where we're going to start here is to think about these different components of GDP as fairly well modeled in the baseline as constant shares of potential. So this math states that consumption at a point in time is equal to the long run consumption share, 0.64, that's A bar C, times potential GDP at time t. So consumption is 64% of potential, and that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. Government is also going to look like that too, and again it's 20% potential. So all these things look exactly the same. Exports is going to be its long-run share, I think that was 9% of GDP. Imports are 11%. And why? Well, it's because we see this in the data. The consumption in particular is a lot smoother than actual output, and so that's what this is saying. The consumption is going to be 64% of permanent income, and the rest is some other form of either government consumption on our behalf, or it could also be investment or saving. And then this also links up to what we had talked about previously in the course on personal finance and planning, that when this kind of thing is going on, the story of a constant share of permanent income is equivalent to long-run planning. The consumers are saving in some way so that their consumption, their food and their apartment rent and all that stuff doesn't really fluctuate, because one wouldn't want it to. You need to sleep somewhere, and you need to eat, you need to pay for your gas. And so ideally, if you have the means to do it, of course, consumption should be basically, stable. It shouldn't be fluctuating around, ideally not with unemployment and things like that. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's realistic? Yeah.
Just if the share of investment is fluctuating,
yes.
How is everything else remaining constant? The total share still has to be.
If the question was if the share if the share in GDP accounted for by investment is fluctuating, how does that square with the assumption that everything else is constant and everything sums to 1 also? Good question. It does. You'll see shortly. I mean, basically what's happening is that the little A bars are all in the long run constant, and they all sum to 1. The part of investment that is fluctuating is a separate part. And I guess the most intuitive way to answer your question is to say the following. The A bars are basically a story about potential GDP, and investment is going to be a story about how current GDP departs from potential sometimes. It can be either above or below it. Yeah?
So the amount of investment depends on the business cycle?
The amount of investment depends on the business cycle. You could say that, yeah. Or you could also say the amount of investment basically triggers the business cycle. If the economy is growing, basically people will invest more. You could definitely view it that way. Yeah, I think to get intuition about what's happening here. Yes. The other thing that is going to be important is that suppose the economy is growing very rapidly, and it might not have been a story about high investment to begin with. It could be a story about something else. And so there are going to be two things in here. One is that investment tends to kind of, to do that, to be higher when the economy is doing better. That's true. But there's a tool here also, and that is that, if the economy is doing, let's put it the other way, if the economy is doing really poorly, what can you do to get it back on track? And the answer is you can change the short-run interest rate to stimulate investment spending. So both are true. I think the way you were viewing it was that if the economy is good, investment spending is higher, which is kind of a, economy good, investment spending reacts. And that's actually true. It's not maybe the most obvious thing to see in this model, but it is correct. The thing I think that is important is that, suppose the economy is booming, it's going to turn out that that means that inflation is rising. Well, how do you get rid of inflation? It turns out what you need to be doing is reducing GDP. And how do you do that? Well, you raise the real interest rate and you reduce investments. And so that's the tool through which we try to moderate things. So this is investment. It's I remember I posed a question that nobody answered, and that's okay because I don't remember what it was. So we got some other conversation going on, and I think that's just fine. Investment is a little bit different. It's really the same kind of story as the other math that we've seen already here. It's just that what we've done is put y bar on the left-hand side in the denominator. So the left-hand side is I over y bar. The investment share of potential GDP is equal to A bar I, which is 18%, and that's always 18%, and then also a minus B times R minus R bar. And so what does this mean? Well, suppose the right-hand part wasn't there. It's just saying this, and if you multiplied through by y bar, you would see this, that investment is just the investment share times potential. So it's the same story, is the same assumption as before, that if you didn't have interest rates that could vary up and down, that's the right-hand part of the right-hand side, you would find that investment is equal to some constant share of potential GDP. The other part is telling us that when the real interest rate, which is uppercase R, is above the marginal product of capital, then this term is positive. Our uppercase R is greater than R bar, so the whole thing is positive. And investment should drop lower because the whole thing gets multiplied by minus B. Well, why are these things in there at all? Well, what's the marginal product of capital? Well, it's some crazy math that I might show you on an exam, right? But I mean, the concept is what exactly? Well, the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage, right? So what's the marginal product of capital? It's the interest rate. Well, it's the return to capital, right? It's what you get out of capital. If you own capital, that's what you get. So the way to make this intuitive is the following. The return to capital is the marginal product of capital, and that's what you get from owning capital. Whom are we talking about here? We're talking about businesses conducting fixed investment spending on new capital. So what you'd want to know is how the returns to the new capital, and that's little r bar, it's the marginal product, how the returns to owning the capital compare with the interest rate that you're on the hook for to the bank. So if the interest rate you're paying back the bank, uppercase R, is really, really high, it's probably not that great of a deal to invest in capital, to borrow from the bank to begin with, and then invest in capital, earn the marginal product of capital, and then you've got to pay back the bank. We're making the assumption here that investment doesn't go to zero when uppercase R, when the interest rate is above the marginal product of capital. The way to think about it is that there are probably a whole bunch of different types of ventures out there that you could invest in. And some are more rewarding on average than others. So the ones that are more rewarding, that would still happen even when there's a higher interest rate, like Google, right, was just massively profitable, and that probably would have been financed regardless, even no matter how high or how low the real interest rate was. So that's why this is in there. It's a story about the money that you're on the hook for. That's uppercase R to the bank. You have to pay the bank that. And if it's above the marginal product of capital that you're earning on the capital investment, you might not borrow to make the capital investment. Okay, so here's a numerical example, if that helps a little bit. Suppose that, and this is a little out of date, I haven't updated it. Suppose that A bar I is 15%. We've seen that in the data it's actually more like 18%, but ballpark. Then if you have the real interest rate equal to the long-term marginal product of capital, then investment is 15% of GDP. Now suppose that this coefficient B is 1/2 or 0.5, and suppose that the real interest rate were 5 percentage points below the marginal product of capital. So here R bar is 15%, uppercase R is 10%. It's a story about the real interest rate then falling below the marginal product of capital. So is it a good or a bad deal to invest in capital under these conditions? So capital gets you the marginal product, little r bar, but you're on the hook for uppercase R. So is it a good or a bad deal to borrow? It's a good deal, and it's because little r bar is high. The marginal product of capital, what you get is 15%. What you owe the bank is 10%, so it's a good deal. So if the interest rate is lower, it's a good deal to go into debt and invest in capital. So you borrow from the bank and you buy some capital. And so this math would work out in the following way, that the investment share of potential at this point in time would be the 15 percentage points you typically get. That's from little a bar sub I, plus, or minus rather, excuse me, 0.5 or 1/2 times the difference between the real interest rate 10% and the marginal product of capital of 15%. So the issue here is just getting the signs right. 10 minus 15 is equal to -5, and then negative 0.5, that's the coefficient, times -5 becomes positive 0.5 times 5. Okay, so that the signs flip here because we've got a negative coefficient times a negative number inside the parentheses. And half of 5 percentage points is 0.025 or 2.5 percentage points. So the story then is about how, in this case, the interest rate was lower than the marginal product of capital. It stimulated investment spending up to 17.5% of potential, whereas it usually is 15%. So getting back to this question you had, I guess, if you added this to the other components, you would find something in excess of 100% of potential. And that's okay. I mean, the difference is this term right here. So at the end of the day, if this happened and nothing else were going on, you would find that current GDP is 2.5% above potential. Or equivalently, if you work through the math, you would find Y tilde is 2.5% or 0.025. Okay? Well, formally now, and I know you're going to really enjoy what we do today. This is a whole bunch of math. We're going to formally derive the IS curve now using what we have set out. So here's what we know, and we're going to add in what we know and come up with a formula for the IS curve. So first of all, GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. And now the trick is going to be to divide through by potential GDP. And it turns out that that's helpful because we have made assumptions about what consumption is as a function of potential GDP. Consumption is equal to A bar C, or which is 64% of potential GDP. So if you divide both sides, you would find, by potential, you'd find that C over Y bar is equal to this percentage number, this A bar C, 0.64. So here's the first step. Everything is divided by potential GDP. And now we're going to substitute for all of these using our rules. Okay, I know what the question I posed for everybody, and then we went in a different direction. Let me just say, because I feel happy that I remembered it now, and I'm sorry I forgot it earlier. I wanted you to think about whether or not you felt that this part of the model, so here and now I'm going to substitute for consumption as a share of permanent income, is just a constant number. It's 0.64. I wanted you to think about whether you thought that was realistic or not. I showed you the data where consumption is more flat or straight line than the other shares of GDP. But this is a fairly strong assumption still. It says that consumption each year is basically, sort of fixed well in advance of what is happening to current GDP. So unemployment could be really, really high, and consumption would be just what it is and nothing, not changing. So the question for you to think about is whether or not you think that's actually realistic or not. Here's the investment piece, which is the most interesting part of this. In the future, we're going to open this up a little bit more, and exports and imports will actually also depend on the real interest rate. But for now, the main story is going to be coming out of this piece pretty much alone. So C over Y bar is equal to A bar C. The investment share of total potential GDP is equal to little a bar I minus B times R minus R bar. The next part is just government. We're going to say that that's also just a constant share of potential. And then the same with exports and imports. So a big bunch of horrible, messy stuff here. Why am I doing this to you? Well, sit tight. The math does clear up, and you'll see shortly why this is helpful to do this, to kind of formalize what's going on. So if we next, in this, I kind of just have to tell you that we're going to do this. We're going to subtract the number 1 from both sides. And the reason why this is helpful is that if you squint at the left-hand side, it's y over y bar. Well, what is that exactly? Well, suppose that current GDP was $15 trillion and potential GDP was $14 trillion. What would y over y bar be? Well, it would be 15 over 14. What kind of a number is that? Is it about 0, or is it about 1 or 10? It's about 1, right? It's a little bit over 1. And in particular, it turns out it's actually 1 plus the percentage deviation between those two numbers. This is that on the left-hand side, if I subtract 1, it's going to give me the percentage deviation between current GDP and potential, or short-run output. So this is just the left-hand side right now, and I have to also subtract 1 from the right-hand side. All this is true now. It's just that I haven't actually completed the story of the third line of math yet. I'm just trying to motivate. Well, why do you subtract 1 from both sides? Well, there are kind of 2 reasons. One is I just told you we're going to do that, and on an exam I would also tell you that we're going to do that. The second reason is, well, it's on the left-hand side here we have rather cleverly divided by potential GDP. We've gotten something that kind of looks like short-run output. This is the thing that's in the IS curve, and we want to derive a relationship for it. So if we subtract 1 from both sides here, we're going to have an equation for short-run output, for y tilde, which shows up on the left-hand side. Okay. So what's the other side of the equation? Now, moving ahead, well, it's this horrible mess here, where I've shown you all of this in the previous slide, except for the last little guy that was minus 1. And here, too, I know this is confusing, but what we're going to do is just define a new parameter that's a bar, which is just the kind of the granddaddy sum of all these things, plus the number 1 there. And it's just, it's all the a's kind of all smushed together, and, I mean, that's not a bad way of simplifying because they're all very functionally similar. They are the different long-run shares of GDP that are accounted for by these different expenditure components. And now we're going to rewrite using a bar. Well, the top line of math here has got a bar C, and then it's got this investment piece, right? A bar I minus B times R minus R bar. That's the interesting part. All these little a's and the number 1 are not very interesting, and so if we substitute here, we're going to find that all we've got left is the interesting part, the B times R minus R bar, and then this A bar thing, which just collects all these sort of garbage terms that are all sort of similarly meaninged. They all are kind of the same concept. Now, what have we got? Well, we've got a downward sloping line here that shows the relationship between y tilde and the interest rate, uppercase R. So this is the IS curve. And it's a straight line here with, as long as A bar is it's the intercept term, basically, as long as it's a constant, and as long as B bar doesn't change either. And that's our assumption that it doesn't. So the equation tells us, I'm so sorry about this. This is not legible. I apologize. This is the danger of technology over time, that unfortunately upgrades in the software sometimes downgrade what they look like. Let me just say this in words. When the interest rate is above the marginal product of capital, then the short-run output is going to be lower. When the interest rate is above the marginal product of capital, it's less of a good deal to conduct business investment. And so that then pulls short run output lower. Question in the back.
Where did the -1 go?
Good question. So where did the -1 go? If you look here, and I apologize for not having my laser pointer. If you look here at the top line, so you see a -1 there, and I think what you're asking is, where did it go after the second line into the third line? And the answer is we're using the second line, which defines A bar, the guy, the granddaddy, sort of intercept term, as the sum of all these other A bars minus 1. So we're using that to substitute into the top equation. So it's got the -1 in it, right? And if you substitute the second line into the first line, all that you find left is what's shown in then the third line. Okay, so where's the -1 go? Well, we've defined it as part of A bar. I wish I could reach, I can't. Okay, so it just kind of goes away. Yeah.
And then, was
Yeah.
it also YT -1 equals all that -1? So what about the -1 on the
What about the -1 on the left-hand side? That's also a good question. Well, it's kind of there, but it's part of Y tilde. So let me back up to the previous slide and show you. Let me just get everything going here. So we're subtracting 1 from both sides. So on the left-hand side is Y over Y bar originally, and then we're subtracting 1 from both sides. So on the left-hand side, this is what you get, the very bottom line of the math. And it turns out that Y over Y bar is equal to Y over Y bar minus Y bar over Y bar. I'm sorry, I said this wrong. Combining with the 1, right? That's how you get this part. And that together then is Y tilde. Clear? Yeah, good, okay. Question?
A bar.
Yeah.
Is it positive?
What is A bar? That's a really good question. Let me just put in the next slide here. What is A bar? Let me just stop before my messed math last. I'm really sorry about that. I'll fix that. I apologize. What is A bar? Well, do you remember the story about all the other little sons and daughter A bars that are on the left-hand side of the second equation here? So little A bar C, that's like 0.64. Little A bar I is 0.18. It's the expenditure shares of GDP. Well, what is the sum of AC, AI, AG, AEX, AIM, with the minus sign in front of it? That's all equal to 1. And now you're subtracting off 1, so it's 0. And so you might think, well, doesn't it just cancel out? Well, it's 0 normally, but what's critical is that the IS curve is going to need to shift back and forth. So the story about interest rates changing is a story about moving up or down along the IS curve. But in economics, there's always two things that can happen, right? Either the curve, there's movement along the curve, and that's the story about the interest rate, or there could be shifts in the curve. And so what's going to be happening sometimes is that these component A bars can be temporarily higher or lower. And the story would be something like the following. A bar C, which is the consumption share of potential GDP, might fall by a lot if what happened was everybody's houses suddenly lost value big time. Like, basically your main asset loses a bunch of value overnight and you feel poorer. And so temporarily, you're probably going to tighten your belt and reduce your consumption. And that's a story about A bar C becoming temporarily lower, in which case A bar, which is the sum of all these components minus 1, would also become temporarily lower, and in negative, basically. Yeah?
Would it be safe to assume that if you're not spending, you're saving? So
Yes.
would that go into A bar I, thus making it 1 again?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's also a little confusing, and I'm almost regretting answering it, but it's a very good question. His question was the following. Well, in the story that I just told, isn't it true that if consumers don't spend their money, if they don't consume it, then they're saving it?
Or where would it go?
Yeah, where does it go then? And I think the best way to think about that, I mean, let me just complete the thought. Where does it go then if it does not then go into investment? Because isn't saving equal to investment? And that's a really good question. And in the short run, what happens is saving isn't necessarily always equal to investment. And it's in part because there are these fluctuations. You know, people get scared, whatever you want to say. I mean, there are special times when, in the short run, things can kind of be different than what they normally are. Another way of thinking about it is that saving equals investment in the solo model, where we are all workers and capitalists and we do everything, you know. In the real world, what happens is that the consuming sector, the consumers like you and me, we are very different from the businesses that are conducting investment spending. So when we consume or save, either we consumption spend or we save our money, well, where do the savings go? It goes into a bank, and then a business somewhere takes out the bank loan and then conducts investment spending. We don't actually do it ourselves, you see. So with all these intermediaries along the way, you can think about it that way. It can, there are a bunch of people whose decisions are important for getting savings transmitted into investment. And in the short run, it doesn't always happen automatically, but you would think it would in the long run. So during recessions, often what happens is either the bank or the entrepreneur who wants to borrow from the bank gets cold feet, and they don't do it. So the savings just sit there. And we could also tell a story about the reverse happening, I guess, about consumption rising real high and maybe choking off savings for investment. But yeah, that also takes us down the road of thinking about, well, if consumption is on the rise in the United States, and it is, how are we financing our fixed investment spending? And the answer is it's from saving that's imported from abroad. It's from saving by Chinese and other people around the world. Germans, too, it turns out. Okay, so I apologize for this last bullet being a mess. Okay, so in the long run, we need to have the real interest rate being equal to the marginal project capital. It isn't necessarily the case that that's equal in the short run. In the long run, though, and this may not just sound very obvious to you, because the problem is we've been in a short run that has lasted for about 5 or 6 years now. I guess almost 6 years. The short run interest rate, that's uppercase R. That's the thing that is determined by the Federal Reserve. And some of you may know that uppercase R, the short run real interest rate, has basically been zero for about 5 years now. It was December of 2008, I think, when it was finally brought all the way to zero. So we've been in a short run that just lasted for 5 years. I mean, that's kind of one of the challenges here. But normally, the real interest rate is higher than zero. A good estimate would be around maybe 3 or 4% or something like that per year. And we haven't seen that in quite some time. But if you are an accounting major, or if you have taken money in banking, or if you just like to read the business section of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you can actually see that the long run interest rates on various things like corporate debt, which typically is like a 10-year maturity, or longer run government bonds, those interest rates are more like 2 or 3%. They're not real high, but they are higher, and it's because financial markets are expecting the real interest rate to rise over time. The other thing to say here, and this gets back to your question too, is what is A bar? Well, it's equal to zero in the long run, but there are times when this can change, and so that's going to be a demand shock. It's going to be a thing that shifts the IS curve, and I think it's best to think about it left or right, as we'll see in a second here. Whoops, what's going on here? Sorry about that. Changes in A bar are demand shocks that shift the IS curve left or right, because everything we've been talking about derives from the demand side. The consumers, the investment spending side of things, government spending, and not from labor or capital. So I think it's very helpful for you to think about things in that way. The dichotomy of the supply side basically being labor and capital that produces potential GDP, and then the demand side, consumers primarily, but also the foreign sector, also government, and especially investment spending as being the things that can either be too high or too low, depending on what's going on. So, I do apologize. In the end of the day, this math at the very top is the IS curve, and it's important that we know how to derive it, but it basically is just the downward sloping line that I've already shown you. So you may feel like we've spent a lot of time doing rather worthless things, but hopefully I will convince you that it is worth doing, and I'll show you in a second why. So the problem here is, I think as we saw with the Phillips curve last time, the zeros here are going to be kind of strangely placed. So the zero on the horizontal axis is going to be kind of in the middle of it all. It's where short-run output is equal to 0, that's a story about GDP being exactly equal to potential GDP, and it's here right in the middle. Where does that happen, provided that the IS curve has not shifted? It happens where the real interest rate, which is the vertical variable, is equal to R bar, which is the marginal product of capital, or the long-run interest rate that ought to be prevailing. Okay. Say something else. Okay, that's right. I was going to say the following. I think one of the most challenging things, there's so many difficult things about this model, but one of the most challenging things to keep straight here is, I've written down the math. It's y tilde is equal to a minus b times r minus r bar. Except for the weird part about the r bar in there, it looks a lot like your algebra from high school with an equation of a straight line, right? It looks kind of normal except for that weird r bar thing. Here's the problem that's rather confusing. What's the horizontal variable? Is it r or y tilde? Which one is the horizontal variable in the graph? It's actually y tilde. It's not r. Yeah. That's the confusing thing. So those of you who said r were probably looking at the algebra, the math, right? And you said, well, the horizontal variable is r, because that's the thing on the right-hand side with the slope coefficient on it. So that's, I think, difficult to get one's head around here, that you could manipulate the math to show us r as a function of y tilde, right? And that would be consistent with how this is the horizontal variable. Why don't we do it that way? Well, the story is one in which the interest rate R changes investment and thus produces what short-run output is, y tilde. And so mathematically, it makes more sense to think about it as y tilde being a function of R. But what we've got here in the graph is the interest rate along the vertical axis, and that's the problem, basically, that typically we would normally, well, this is always screwed up in economics, isn't it? When the price is along the vertical axis and quantity is along the horizontal, I guess the story is, well, we believe that quantity determines price. But that's not always really the case, I guess. This is kind of a long-standing tradition in economics to get this all screwed up and backwards. So, bottom line, why is this tough for you? Well, if I were to ask you what is the slope of the IS curve, what would you say? You would say minus b. Yeah, but is that in fact the slope of this curve? The slope is known as the rise over the run, and so in fact it's not. It's actually 1 over b, right? It's actually the reciprocal of that. That's kind of the challenge. So if I were to tell you that the IS curve got flatter, it's actually a story about b getting bigger, and so 1 over b gets smaller. So that's kind of a real unfortunate thing here. I hope you will agree with me at the end of the story when we see the whole thing working together. There's a reason why we show it this way. It's just that that's one of, unfortunately, the more challenging aspects, is to think about, what's the horizontal, what's the vertical, and what's the slope. It's kind of a problem. All right, so suppose that we've gotten, suppose that we think about the interest rate rising here. If the interest rate were to rise above the marginal product of capital, the IS curve itself doesn't shift. This is a story about a movement along the IS curve. And so what's going to happen next class, and maybe this class if we get to it, but there's going to be another curve here. The central bank, in this case the Federal Reserve for the United States, sets the real interest rate. And there's going to be another curve that shows up as basically the interest rate that the central bank sets. And the central bank is allowed to basically choose where along the IS curve it wants to operate. It can just set in a real interest rate. Here's a story about the Fed setting an interest rate that's above the marginal product of capital. And when that happens, then investment activities like housing purchases and other capital expenditures decline, and so short-run output becomes negative. So this would be a story about the Fed raising the real interest rate and causing a recession. And you might wonder, well, why would the Federal Reserve ever do that? And it turns out the reason is inflation might be the target. There are also shifts in the IS curve, so this is a story about movement along the curve. Any change in the real interest rate is a movement along the curve, but there also can be shifts in the IS curve. So these are all generically called demand shocks, and all of them will shift the intercept of the IS curve A bar. Now, again, it's not maybe obvious to me that you need to think of this as a leftward or rightward shift rather than an upward or downward shift, but I think it makes more sense to think about it as leftward or rightward because A bar directly adds to Y tilde or subtracts. So if A bar gets bigger, it means that for every real interest rate, there's now more Y tilde, so the whole thing shifts out to the right. Suppose that, in the short run, the saving rate declines, people spend a lot more. And why might they do that? Well, I don't know, they're happy, they think that they can borrow a whole bunch against their income and it doesn't matter, that sort of thing. And, you might argue that this is the reason why, there was some overextension of mortgages because people were buying a whole bunch of houses that probably they shouldn't have been buying at the time. So we know that consumption is given by this relationship, that consumption is usually a fixed share of potential GDP, and the way to model this then with the IS curve math is to suppose that a temporary reduction in the saving rate and an increase in the spending rate is a story about A bar C temporarily increasing. So when it temporarily increases, it pulls up the whole intercept to a higher number. And graphically, I think this is best seen as a rightward shift in the IS curve. You could also say, well, it's an upward shift too. I mean, they're sort of, geometrically equivalent. But the story is that, whatever this increase is, it adds on to short-run output at every interest rate. What might happen after this? Well, shortly we're going to see that the Federal Reserve might step in and raise the real interest rate in order to pull us back down to zero here. The short-run output is when it's above zero, it tends to be increasing inflation, and the Fed doesn't like that. And so what it's going to do in response to something like this is to raise interest rates. Now, the obvious thing you might say is that if I'm right about that, why didn't the Fed raise interest rates back during the expansion in the 2000s, and why was it the case that housing got purchased in large quantities that was not maybe what it should have been happening, and so why we have the problem that we did? And that's a really good question. Why did the Fed not just raise interest rates and shift us along the new IS curve back toward stability? Questions about the IS curve? Okay. Well, I wanted to talk now a little bit more about the guts of the math here and why I subjected you to it. Well, let's think about this assumption of consumers being, smart about planning their consumption over long periods of their lives. And I think, as we discussed last time this came out formally, it comes out of this story of the life cycle and how people approach spending or saving. I think many of you would agree with me that it's not obvious that in fact we have an economy where consumers are going to be good at planning things and good about keeping their consumption stable over the business cycle. So we discussed this in class, I think it was 14, that some people just might blow it all if they win the lottery, and it might look something like this. So the lottery increases your income, which is the blue line, at some point. So, and it looks like this individual just started working, so they're about maybe 30 years old, and they win the lottery there. And so either they could choose to have this consumption schedule now where it just jumps up and then comes right back down. So you're living at home, right, with your mom. All of a sudden you win the lottery, and this individual does not rent his or her own apartment. He or she rather just goes out and buys a bunch of Lamborghinis and crashes them all and has a lot of fun with that. Right? That's what this person does. and then they're right back to where they are. They move back in with their mom, after crashing in the Lamborghinis, and go on their merry way throughout life. That's one way of approaching a lottery winning, but others might decide to kind of smooth consumption a bit more. So they get the red line and then the green line, so they don't ever jump up. They get the red line at the beginning and then the green line. They just elevate their consumption a little bit. So which is more typical? Do people who win the lottery, do they blow it all? And again, this is a little overdrawn. I mean, it doesn't have to be a lottery. You could think about getting a temporary raise or something like that in your, whether or not you sort of pocket that and save it for later, or whether you just go out and blow it all. In April, and of course it could even be earlier, but some of you may be filing your own tax returns, and you may be expecting that you're going to get a big refund. And another question is, well, suppose you get this tax refund in the mail, what do you do with it? Does anybody get tax refunds? What do you do with it?
Save it.
You save it. Yeah, okay. So there are many people who save their tax refunds, and there are also people who spend it. So the rule of thumb that ends up, we see in the data is that maybe 30 to 50%, I think what I'm going to do is assume that there's a share that's 40% of fluctuations in current income gets spent. Well, what are the macroeconomic implications of just blowing it all? When people spend some share Z of their incomes, then income fluctuations become multiplied. So when people are doing this kind of thing where they will spend out of their temporary fluctuations in income, when they have more cash in their pockets, they're happier and they go out and blow it all, rather than kind of saving it for a rainy day. If that were to happen, then it turns out the IS curve becomes a little different than it normally does, and income fluctuations become multiplied. How do we model this? Well, suppose instead of this assumption, we have this story. So the consumption share of permanent income is equal to the long run share, A bar C, which again is about 0.64, plus Z bar, which is this share. It's, I said it was maybe 40%, so Z bar is 0.4, times this percentage change in GDP compared to potential. So the multiplier has to be something that's between 0 and 1. You can't spend more than the temporary share, and you also can't spend less than 0 of it. And so it turns out that the IS curve is going to get modified a little bit. Rather than the original IS curve, which is the stuff that's in parentheses, so here's the original IS curve on the right-hand side. Rather than just that, it turns out that what happens is this pops out as a multiplier. And it turns out that if Z is between 0 and 1, 1 over 1 minus Z is 1 over a number that's less than 1, and that itself then is a number that's greater than 1. So this is the multiplier, and it increases Y tilde, or short-run output. So when people behave in this way, that they get a little bit more extra cash in their pockets, they go out and they blow it. And the reverse is that when times are tough, maybe somebody loses a job temporarily, they cut back a lot on consumption spending. And what that then does is during a tough time, it reduces short-run output even more. And here I've said increases. You could think about it as increasing the magnitude. Short-run output could be negative too. And what the multiplier does is multiply up. If it's a negative number, it makes it a bigger negative number. Okay, so it turns out that this consumption behavior thing is rather important. And as you might imagine, so some of us save our income tax refunds, but many people don't. And how many people don't save them versus how many who do is a rather important parameter for macroeconomic behavior. How much fluctuation is there? So let's formalize this then. We've got about 10 minutes remaining. Going back to the IS curve, well, again, so what do we do to derive the IS curve? You start with what you know. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus EX minus IM. Divide through by potential GDP. That's what you get next. And now, again, as before, we're going to substitute for all these using our rules. But the difference now is that consumption as a share of permanent income is a little different, right? So the Y tilde is actually already in this piece. Yeah, question.
How would that be if you put your return either on an investment or production of income? Will you consider that you want it off or saving it? If you make an investment for production.
Could you rephrase? I'm not sure I understand.
This is the tax refund.
Yeah.
And instead of you want it off and spending it on something that's
Yeah.
not giving you back income,
Yeah.
you put into an investment that's producing income.
Yeah.
Now is that saving it?
That's saving it, yeah. So the question is, suppose you get a tax refund, and there are two basic things you can do with it. You can blow it by consuming it, buying McDonald's or something, or you can save it. And what you were saying is, well, what if I invested in a productive investment, and that's saving it, right? Yeah. The thing is that the person who actually turns it into investment spending is not you. You're saving it, and it goes into a bank or to a mutual fund or something like that. And so it earns you a return, but the thing is, you want to sort of just divorce in your head that act from investment spending, which is not done by you, it's done by somebody else, presumably with the credit they get from your saving that the bank has given them. Okay, so back to the story here. So what's different now is that there's this ZY tilde that shows up on the right-hand side, and it's because consumption now has this extra term. It fluctuates along a little bit, along with Y tilde. So actually, just backing up, in words, what does this stuff with the red lines under it mean? It means that consumption typically is 64% of GDP plus 40% of the temporary fluctuation in income. So if you have 2% higher income, people spend 40% of that, which is 0.8%, right? It's not quite half. So a 2% fluctuation in income, well, people spend 0.8 percentage points of that, or 40%. So the investment piece is the same, the government piece is all the same, all this is just the same. The difference is this Y tilde that's on the right-hand side. So what did we do before? Well, again, I just told you the magic is that we subtract 1 from both sides, so that the left-hand side equals Y tilde. The right-hand side is going to be this horrific mess of all the little A bars, plus a Z times the Y tilde, plus the investment thing, which depends on the interest rate, plus all the other junk minus 1. And now let me write up what we've got. So Y tilde is equal to all this junk. So that's what's going to appear on this next slide. So let's combine terms on the left-hand side and move, so I'm sorry. So that what we're doing is moving the Y tilde to the left-hand side and then combining the terms. On the right-hand side, I know it doesn't look familiar, but now the second line of math, in fact, has a right-hand side that is just the original IS curve now that we've moved the ZY tilde thing to the left-hand side. So if we combine those two things, there's a Y tilde minus ZY tilde on the left-hand side. Well, that's equal to 1 minus Z times Y tilde, right? So we're just combining these two terms on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is just the standard IS curve. So then finally, this fourth line of math, I'm just going to substitute on the right-hand side using our original A bar. So all this junk just becomes A bar minus B times R minus R bar, but then the left-hand side still is a little different. It's got the 1 minus Z bar times Y tilde. Finally, divide through by 1 minus Z, and that's the new IS curve. What's Z? It's the consumer share. It's the amount of temporary spending, temporary income that gets spent rather than just saved. So it's the extra kind of fluctuation that's out there because people are doing, you could say, hand-to-mouth kind of consumption. So if they earn, $10 a day, that's an awfully small amount of money, but they then spend the $10. They don't save any. They don't draw out of assets or anything like that. They basically consume what they are earning. Well, so what does this multiplier do? Well, it turns out that it actually enhances the power of fiscal and monetary policies. And how to think about that? Well, think about a construction worker who gets a job on a new bridge. If the construction worker spends a lot of current income rather than saving it, maybe 40% or something like that, then if government spending, so that's the other thing maybe I haven't told you here, but government can increase the amount of GDP it purchases. It might do it by, going into further debt, which might not be good in the long run, but it can, in the short run, increase government spending. And that is what happened back in 2009. The amount that government spending increased was something, I think, around $500 billion. It was a pretty big amount of money. In the model then, so the government spends more, it increases a bar by government spending, and it turns out that then the change in Y tilde, the increase in short-run output, is the original government spending of, say, 1%, but times this multiplier piece. And that raises it, if z is equal to 0.04, by a factor of what it's, raises it by 5/3, I guess. So rather than a 1% increase in GDP, we would see a 1.67 increase, a bigger increase in GDP for a particular government spending increase of 1%. So that's what we would see then. That's technically called fiscal policy. So there's a multiplier. People are spending a larger portion of temporary fluctuations in their income, and there's a larger effect on short-run output than normal. Now, the challenge is, graphically, this is the real head-scratcher. What does this mean graphically for the IS curve? And the problem is that Y tilde is actually the horizontal or x-axis variable. And so with a scant amount of time remaining, let me just jump to the punchline here. You might think that the multiplier being bigger than 1, it increases the slope or steepens the IS curve, and in fact, it just does the reverse. The IS curve becomes flatter. You get a bigger change in output for a particular change in the real interest rate, and you also get a bigger jump in the IS curve for a particular stimulus. If government decides to spend more, that's an increase in A bar, it's a shift in the IS curve, and you get a bigger jump from that, but also monetary policy is going to be affected by it. So here's the original IS curve. When you've got the IS curve with a multiplier, because people are spending some share of their temporary incomes, then you see this kind of thing happening. The IS curve is flatter. So for a particular change in the real interest rate, you would see